It is with great pleasure I get to introduce Douglas Tallamy, whose book, Bringing Nature Home, in 2007, when I read it, it changed my life. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, Tree Pittsburgh, the Botanical Society of Western Pennsylvania, and the Men's Garden Club of Pittsburgh. I would also like to thank our financial co-sponsors, the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania, which is one of 7 Audubons in the nation that has a special native plant center where you can buy native plants. Also, I'd like to thank the Allegheny County chapter of the Izaak Walton League of America. So, if you look on eBird, you can see the migration maps of birds like the scarlet tanagers and wood thrush. And those migrations go right through Allegheny County. Now, in the past 50 years, these birds have dropped 50% in population. They have dropped 50% in population primarily due to loss of habitat. And these are birds that I saw with my own eyes with binoculars as a kid. And so I'm thinking to myself now, what can I do with my own 2 hands? So 5.5 years ago, I bought a house on 2.5 acres with half of it woods. And I found that I had all these agreeable neighbors, almost half a dozen of them or so, who were willing to allow me to remove the non-native invasive plants and replace and plant native plants and trees and shrubs. And over the past 5.5 years, we've planted over 1,000 native trees and shrubs. And one of the things that was helpful were these wholesale nurseries like Musser's Nursery in Indiana, Pennsylvania, where you could get 300 serviceberry seedlings for about 55 cents a piece. Of course, if you get 300 seedlings, that means you have to plant 300 seedlings, you have to dig 300 holes, and you also have to get 300 cages to protect them from the deer, because the white-tailed deer have evolved to eat everything except galvanized steel. Now, in the past few years, I've noticed some changes. Like the last 2 years, Cooper's hawks have nested 150 feet from my kitchen door. Also, fireflies would come, also dragonflies. In the last 2 years, I've been seeing dragonflies. And then native wildflowers that I never planted started showing up in the woods. So I mentioned the Izaak Walton League. So last fall, we planted 150 eastern white pine trees, 100 northern bayberry shrubs, and about 60 native trees and shrubs. I am a member, as I also coordinate the native plant restoration projects. And this spring, we're planting 400 native shrubs on 4 different creeks, 100 native shrubs per creek. And creeks are great because if you plant on creeks, you never will have to worry about watering them afterwards. Now, if you know of a creek in Allegheny County where we can have permission to plant, please let me know. And with that, I would like to, with further ado, I'd like to go to Douglas Tallamy. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody. What I want to do tonight is give you my idea of what nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I want to return to what happened in the East, actually from Massachusetts to Georgia and then all the way to the Mississippi, not this fall, but the previous fall. We had what we call an oak mast, where all the members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of that acorn. First it chewed a little hole and forced its head through. And then it forced its entire body through that little hole. It was a tight squeeze. Kind of looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally plopped down. This is a very dangerous time for this insect larva because it tastes good. Everything wants to eat it. So it gets to safety by squirming below the surface of the soil in about 30 seconds. And once it's down, it stretches in all directions and forms a little chamber. And then within that chamber, it pupates, converts itself to a pupa. Then mysteriously, it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. This is what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think they have big noses, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And down at the end of that extension, that's where the mouth parts are. And they take those mouth parts and they chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in it, and that's how the larva gets into the center of the acorn. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the next year as most insects would? Well, it's because red oak acorns take 18 months to complete their development. And if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns. Well, after they're out, of course, that leaves a hole. It's a true vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. So in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants that make their colony entirely within the vacated holes made by acorn weevils in acorns. And if they discover a brand new acorn, they're excited because their old acorn's fallen apart. And they tell everybody, and the first thing they do is start to carry members from the old colony. They get together, they work hard, carry the eggs, the larvae, even the queen into the new acorn. Then they post a guard, make sure nobody else comes in, and they will live there for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. Well, about this time, my wife says, "What's your point? What are you trying to tell us?" What I'm trying to tell you is that is one of literally millions of very specialized interactions that comprise most of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays all over the world actually are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They take the acorns and they fly as far as 2 miles away from the parent tree and then tap it below the ground. The idea, of course, is to go retrieve that acorn in the wintertime and have something to eat. But jays don't have a great memory, and they forget where an awful lot of those acorns are, where they buried. So each individual jay ends up planting thousands of species or individuals of acorns every single year. Found out this year what is pollinating witch hazel. Witch hazel, of course, is it's the latest blooming shrub or small tree that we have. After the leaves have fallen, after frost, they bloom. And you can read that, it's small flies and gnats that pollinate witch hazel. Every time I look at a flower, I never see any small flies or gnats. But if you go out at night, it turns out that there's a group of moths called winter moths, and the bicolored sallow is one of them. And they fly very late. I caught the bicolored sallow on Christmas Eve this year. And it turns out that those winter moths are the primary pollinators of witch hazel. So I don't know whether witch hazel is blooming late to take advantage of winter moths or whether winter moths are flying late to take advantage of witch hazel. But at this point, they're taking advantage of each other. You won't have breeding pileated woodpeckers unless you have lots of carpenter ants, because that is the food that they rear their young on. And you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this plant, Facilia. That is the only pollen that particular bee can rear its young on. And it turns out pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. Over 1/3 of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plant genera. So for example, in our area, there's at least 13 species of native bees that can only reproduce in the pollen of perennial sunflowers. You won't have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. On and on. I could go on all night talking about specialized relationships in nature. But today, these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem, of course, today is that that's not an option anymore. We didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. Well, that's because we logged the country repeatedly. We certainly have tilled it. We've drained it. We've grazed it. We have 770 million acres of rangeland in the US, which is 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We have introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we have carved up the natural world into tiny remnants of its former self. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Why have we done that? Well, I guess we thought the Earth, our nest, was so big we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing headlines like this at a pretty regular clip. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? I'm talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of the North American bird population gone. Now the UN says, oh, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, possibly in the next 20 years. And I love the way they report these headlines. I mean, they might as well say, we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then go on to the next headline as if it doesn't matter. This is not an option, folks. Losing 1 million species is not an option. It's not just a headline. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those small efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, one of the greatest biologists of all times, and probably the greatest alive today, told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects. And he did it way back in 1987 in this paper called The Little Things That Run the World. His message was very simple. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of the flowering plants. And if most of the flowering plants disappeared, energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems would be so drastically altered that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, even many of our freshwater fishes, those food webs would collapse and all those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that right now rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that doesn't have to happen. We could save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself. But to do that, we're going to have to change the way we landscape. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on nature. That means we can't live independently from nature. We're dependent on what we call ecosystem services, the products of healthy ecosystems that keep us alive. How about, this is what plants deliver for us and everything else, by the way. They produce oxygen, pretty important. Clean water so that we can use it before it reaches the sea where it's too salty to use. They capture carbon, enormously important today. They're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of that carbon that they pull from that molecule, and then they pump the extra carbon into the ground through their roots. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plants have put into the ground. They build topsoil and they hold it in place. They prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, and many other things. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of those flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds and other things. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is simply not an option anymore. It never was a good option. But now with 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet, we need more ecosystem services now than ever before. So allocating huge areas of the Earth to dead ecological spaces is simply not sustainable anymore. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent, wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said was, the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, some of the indigenous groups have been good at doing that, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the Earth than it has to offer, completely spoiling an area, going to another place, doing the same thing. And Aldo recognized that, that is not a sustainable relationship with the Earth, and we better fix it. So he had a dream that we humans were actually able to develop what he called a land ethic. He knew that we had to use the Earth, we had to farm it and lumber and graze and mine. But if we did it with a land ethic, we would learn to do it gently. We would use the Earth without destroying local ecosystems. And he wrote about that in the Sand County Almanac. What he didn't talk about was actually developing a land ethic where we live. And I'm not sure why he didn't talk about where we live, but I suspect the notions that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, it's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. But tonight I want to argue that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, conservationists have worked almost exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature, actually reconstruct it where there are a lot of people, because that's most of the planet. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to actually thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where are we going to start? Let's go back to private property. We can't ignore private property because too much of the country is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. About 75% of the entire country is privately owned. If we ignored private property, we'd fail. If we only do conservation on areas that are not privately owned, because it's not enough of the land, then the areas we're working in would be too small and too isolated from each other to sustain the species that we need. But there are a lot of opportunities for conservation that we haven't thought seriously about, but we could. How about power and pipeline rights-of-ways? There's 21 million acres in those types of rights-of-ways. 300 million kilometers of 300,000 kilometers, thank you, of power line cuts in this country alone. It could be wonderful places for conservation. Railroad rights-of-ways, 3 million acres. Roadsides, 17 million acres. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. The Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are huge areas. Then we have all the places we live, both in rural areas and suburbia, and then our cities, hundreds of millions of acres in those types of landscapes. That's 599 million acres right there. And you can think of other places where we're not being serious about conservation, but we could be. How big is 599 million acres? Well, it's big. It's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, California, even Texas in there. Not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do conservation almost anywhere. What I'm really talking about when I talk about conservation is rebuilding the nature that we have dismantled. Putting those specialized relationships back together again, reuniting the players so that you have functional ecosystems. But all species don't contribute equally to ecosystem function. So we have to start with the ones that other species depend on, the building blocks of our ecosystems. There's two I want to focus on tonight. We have to have those flowering plants, remember, but you're not going to have them unless you have the pollinators that keep those plants around. So that's one group that we need to have. But once you have those plants, of course, they're capturing energy from the sun and turning it into food, and it's now in their leaves. Well, if the energy doesn't get from their leaves to other animals, then you don't have a functional food web, you have a collapsed ecosystem. Most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. They eat something. They ate plants. That something is typically insects. And it turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So we have to design landscapes that have lots of caterpillars. If we don't, most of the energy that plants capture from the sun remains in the leaves. Let me give you an example from the Carolina chickadee. That's one of the common birds. It's your feeder right now. And they're eating seeds during the wintertime. So a lot of people think, well, that's all you need for chickadees is seeds. But when it comes time to reproduce, baby chickadees can't eat seeds. And that is typical for most of the birds that are out there. They cannot eat seeds. So the chickadees switch to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young almost exclusively on caterpillars. And it turns out they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds, as opposed to our aquatic birds, rear their young on insects. And most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that support that, but this is a citizen science project that a recent grad student of mine did, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nest, and then send her the pictures. And Ashley identified the prey items that were in the beaks of these birds. She got thousands of pictures from all over the country. The object was to reconstruct the nestling diet based on these pictures for as many common bird families as she could in the country. And she had enough data to do 20 bird families. And out of the 20 bird families, the green bars you're looking at, by the way, are the percentage of the nestling diet that is caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the nestling diet. Which means, again, if we took caterpillars out of our systems, out of our landscapes, most of our birds would not be able to reproduce. So it seems like something special about caterpillars. What is it? Well, it actually turns out there's a number of things that are special about caterpillars, and one of them is they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton, it's cuticle, it's made of chitin, it's undigestible. And the birds don't want a lot of that. So, and because they're soft, you can stuff the caterpillar down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. If you've ever seen a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious, they're very high in fat, very high in protein. They have a low percentage of chitin compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. And you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. And vertebrates cannot make their own carotenoids. We have to get them from plants. And we have to get them from plants because the carotenoids are essential components of our diets. That's why my wife Cindy makes sure I have a lot of carrots. Where's my pointer? A lot of carrots here to get my beta carotene, a lot of tomatoes to get my lycopene, a lot of whatever that is to get my lutein. And when I eat those things, it stimulates my immune system. And I can't think of a better time to have a very healthy immune system. Carotenoids are also antioxidants. They run around our diet and our body and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. Carotenoids improve sperm vitality. They improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this male prothonotary warbler who has had lots of access to lots of luteins. And he takes those luteins and he makes pigments out of them and puts them in his feathers to be bright yellow. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Well, where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? From the prey items that they eat. But as you can see, carotenoids are not equally distributed among bird prey items. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey items. The third bar is orthopteroids, things like grasshoppers, crickets, and katydids. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. It's the caterpillars that ate the green leaves. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. Does carotenoid content influence prey choice among birds, particularly during the breeding season? Well, that was another question that Ashley asked, and she answered it with bluebirds. She got GoPro cameras and put them on the roofs of bluebird houses. And those cameras took a picture once every second. And the object was to get a picture of the bluebirds as they flew into the house with a prey item. And then she would identify the prey item. Well, she had a lot of bluebird houses and a lot of GoPro cameras, and she did it for 3 years. So she had well over 1 million pictures to go through. But out of that 1 million pictures, she got 7,628 that were good enough so she could identify the prey item. And sure enough, caterpillars were brought back more than anything else, and they have the highest level of carotenoids, followed by those orthopteroids. They have the next highest level. Then everybody else with low levels is nestled down here. So all of this suggests that caterpillars are probably essential parts of bird diets. They're not optional. Birds have to have them. So the next question is, how many caterpillars do birds need? Is 1 or 2 enough, or 1 or 2 a day enough? Well, that's a good question. Let's go back to chickadees to answer that. We've got a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? 1 or 2 is not enough. 1 or 2 a day is not enough. It takes thousands of caterpillars to rear 1 clutch of chickadees, just to get them to the point where they they leave the nest, 6,000 to 9,000, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. After they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're talking about really tens of thousands of caterpillars to rear one clutch of a bird that's a third of an ounce. And if you want caterpillars to breed in your yard, and we do, because that's pretty much what's left in an awful lot of places, then you have to have that many caterpillars in your yard, because the chickadee is only foraging about 50 meters from the nest. It's not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we don't landscape in a way that includes all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really starting to look like insect decline is one of the major causes of bird declines. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al., who they were the ones that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups: the ones that required insects at some part of their life history, and the species that don't require insects, things like the doves and the finches that can reproduce on seeds. They actually gained a few numbers over the last 50 years, but the bird species that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. So this doesn't prove cause and effect between insect declines and bird declines, but it certainly is suggestive that there is a tight relationship there. So at this point, I think that's out of an abundance of caution, as they say in the world of COVID, we should start landscaping in a way that produces caterpillars before all the life around us disappears, which is exactly the opposite of the way that we've landscaped in the past. In the past, we have chosen plants specifically because there were no insects that would eat them. We thought plants were just decorations, and we didn't want anything eating our decorations. Well, now, if our goal is different, to actually support some life with our landscapes, then we need to choose plants that support caterpillars. How do we do that? There's a catch. Most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars, so we have to be fussy about which plants we choose. And we have to be fussy because the insects that eat plants, the caterpillars that are eating the plants, are very fussy about which plants they're going to eat. And the monarch butterfly illustrates this as well as anything else. This, of course, is a monarch butterfly caterpillar. And you can have all the Bradford pear, calorie pears you want, all of the forsythias, all of the burning bushes and boxwoods, and any of the ornamental plants we get from Asia in your yard, and you won't support a single monarch butterfly. The only thing they're going to develop on is milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why is that? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. If you don't believe me, go outside and eat a plant next spring. See how you like it. You're not going to like it. All plants are protecting themselves with both chemical and physical defenses. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. There's a reason it is hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. That's my little joke. But this is not a joke. Insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And an insect species can't adapt to all of them. So they pick one or two that are really similar to each other. And they develop the specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the specialized behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that allow them to eat those plants without dying. It takes a long period of evolutionary history with those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And because they're focusing on just one or two plant lineages, they don't develop adaptations for any of the other plants. That's what creates the specialization. And that is why our insects are so poor at eating plants we bring in from other continents. They have not been here long enough for all of these adaptations to fall into place. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to reconstruct food webs in a particular place where we've deconstructed them, we need to pick the right plants. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how easy this is and how well it works when you do pick the right plants. Starting with my house right here. My wife and I live here. I'm sitting in this window. This is in Oxford, Pennsylvania. So we're in the southeast corner of Pennsylvania instead of the southwest corner. We have 10 acres of a farm that was broken up not that long ago. It was a very old farm. It had been farmed for 300 years and it was exhausted. So the last thing they did was to mow the farm for hay. But the area is so thoroughly invaded with Asian ornamentals. So multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and miscanthus and barberry and privet and Callery pear and Norway maple. They're all here. And when you mow for hay, you're really mowing the rootstocks of those invasive plants, and then you call it hay. So of course, when we started to build the house and they stopped the mowing, that's what came back. A giant tangle of Asian plants all over the entire 10 acres. That is Cindy. She's getting ready to rid the property of these plants. And she did. She did it. So when everybody's facing an invasive plant problem, it's hard to find a place that doesn't have it. So don't despair. You really can win that battle on a discrete property. So here's a little Cindy. She did it on 10 acres, which means it's possible for you to do it as well. What was I doing while Cindy was clearing the land? I was telling her she's doing a great job, but I also was putting plants back. The object, of course, was to reestablish the native plant diversity that was here hundreds of years ago. But I also wanted to see how many of the moth species that run the food webs around us would come and colonize these plants as I put them back. And one of the first things I added was I wanted to see if I could get the Canadian owlet. That's what the Canadian owlet looks like. That's what its adult looks like, just like a leaf. So I have to have meadow-rue. That's the only plant they will eat, host plant specialization. So I got some meadow-rue seeds from someplace. The meadow-rue that used to be here was long gone. And I planted them. And, you know, I didn't know if Canadian owlets would ever be able to find my little patch of meadow-rue. I don't know of any meadow-rue around here. So I didn't check the plant. Planted it and left it. It was at least a month and a half before I walked by it. And it was almost defoliated because Canadian owlets had found it right away. So I was surprised, but it was a big success. Now we have a good population of meadow-rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. This beautiful moth, actually it's a misnomer, it has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa ditch daisy. I did know where there was some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I went and got some Biden seeds, planted them. They grew very nicely. It took about a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Bidens, but they did. And now we have a good population of both of those. So that's 4 species we've added to the property. Same story with the hackberry emperor. I wanted the hackberry emperor here because it's a butterfly that should be here. Even though it's not the most beautiful butterfly, it doesn't matter. It's a species that ought to be here. But as its name suggests, it requires hackberry. And we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry. And we had to wait 4 years for the butterflies to find our hackberry, but they finally did. And I walked by one of my hackberry trees this past June. There were 9 hackberry emperor butterfly caterpillars on a single branch. So another big success. Now we've added 6 species. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, but along with it came many of the species that eat goldenrod. There's 110 species of caterpillars in my area that eat goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come, the goldenrod flower moth. That's what its caterpillars look like. I don't know why it hasn't found my goldenrod, but it hasn't yet. So this is anticipation. This is part of the fun of the game here. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out, I look at my goldenrod, try to find these caterpillars. One of these years I'm going to succeed, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. A lot of people don't like it. I don't know why. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. And it is the primary host plant of a lot of the big sphinx moths that are an important component of cardinal food webs, like the Pandora Sphinx and its beautiful adult, like the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted to see if I could get the zebra swallowtail. Now in this corner of Pennsylvania, we're at the northern limit of zebra swallowtails. As a matter of fact, we're 26 miles north of the closest population that I know of. So I was stretching it here. I didn't know if they'd be able to find us. They are pawpaw specialists, and we didn't have any pawpaw, so we planted pawpaw. We had to wait on this one. We waited 9 years for the zebra swallowtails to find our pawpaws, but they finally did. And in the meantime, we got the pawpaw sphinx. I didn't know there was a pawpaw sphinx, and we're getting lots of pawpaws. Wanted to see if I could get the double-toothed prominent because it's just such a cool looking caterpillar. It's a specialist on elms, so I planted American elm. The caterpillar came right away. Wanted to see if I can get the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. So you needed evening primrose. We planted that. The moth comes. It sits in the flower by day. It's very cute. And we planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plants that we put in our yard. I want to focus on oaks for a while, though, because they're such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. You know, and a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. But unless you die the very next year, you can enjoy what your oak is doing for your property. And I can say that with confidence because I planted my oaks, most of them as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50. And right away, they started to bring the important creatures to my yard that support our food webs, like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pig-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and including the Bernie meme caterpillar. We got him this winter. They're out in the winter because they wear gloves. And they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaf litter, and here's a crocus geometer standing on the ground eating the leaves of that oak. So you don't have to wait centuries for your oaks to start to contribute. This is a picture of what our yard looks like now. I'm still sitting in this window right here. Just to convince you, you know, we're traditional. We've got lawn here, but we put a lot of the plants back. And 4 years ago, I made it a goal to try to take a picture of every moth species I could find on our property. I knew it'd be a big job. I didn't know how many there were, but I'm still working at it, actually. But I am up to 1,031 species of moths that I've taken pictures of. We haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. Now, we've got 10 acres in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on our 10 acres, which is 1/240,000th of the landmass of Pennsylvania, we're supporting 40% of the moth species that occur in Pennsylvania. And since most of these species are types of bird foods, we've recorded 59 species of terrestrial birds that have bred on our 10 acres, which is 38% of all the birds that occur in Pennsylvania. Saw this headline this past fall. World Wildlife Fund says 2/3 of wildlife have vanished since 1970. All I can say is not at our house. I would bet you that we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long. So I'm mentioning this just so you don't get, don't give up. These are terrible headlines. They're scary headlines, but it's not inevitable. We can turn it around if we simply put the valuable plants back into our properties. But I know what you're thinking. We have 10 acres and you just have a suburban lot. Will it work on a smaller property? That's a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, where the major invasive plant is bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle. Well, they have 0.6 acres, 18 times less property than Cindy and I have. So the first thing they did when they got their 0.6 acres was to get rid of their bush honeysuckle. Then they planted a lot of native plants and they put in a water feature that they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds. that have used their property, and they're up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. Now just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Yes, it does. And by the way, they're in the middle of suburbia. They're not connected to anything. How about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago because one of the runways of O'Hare Airport is right on the other side of this wall. Kennedy Expressway is right over here. And Pam only has 1/10 of an acre. That is 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. Well, Pam did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, put in a water feature, and she started to count the birds that use her yard. And she is up to 117 species of birds that have used her little postage stamp yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. Pam is not connected to any natural area. She is an island in the middle of urban Chicago. So it shows it does work. But what about city centers? 82% of us live in cities. Well, in 2014, I was staring at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed. But that reminds me, we've got a terrible marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and wonder why people don't plant them. Let's not call it butterfly weed. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. Okay, I was staring at Monarch's Delight 2014, and the first thing I saw were 2 species of leafcutter bees, megachilid bees. I know they're leafcutters because they collect their pollen on their tummies, not on their legs. Leafcutter bees have very specific requirements, or they can't exist in an area. They need pollen and they need nectar, but they also need soft leaves. Leaves of red buds are perfect because they're very soft, and the bees can snip out the edge of the leaves and leave these little semicircles. They roll up what they snipped out into a tube, stuff it full of pollen, lay an egg on it, and that's how they reproduce. Then they put that whole package into a crack or a crevice. This is 3 packages in a row. Here's a picture from Heather Home. And that's what a leafcutter bee reproductive event looks like. Well, there was a redbud growing right next to the Monarch Delight, and I'm pretty sure that's why the leafcutter bees were there. I'm also pretty sure that that's why bumblebees were there. Remember, bumblebees overwinter as queens. So in the spring, when they come out, they have no helpers. They've got to do all the work themselves, and they need a lot of very, very abundant forage so they can start that colony. And if they don't have that, the colony often fails. So that's exactly what redbud provides, and I'm pretty sure that's why the bumblebees were there. Then I saw a monarch on the Monarch's Delight. Actually, I saw 2 monarchs. Now this was 2014. In 2013, I hadn't seen any monarchs at all the entire year. That was the low point of the monarch population. In the east, only 3.6% of the monarchs were left. So, and this was June in 2014. So it's very early for monarchs to get as far north in the east. So I was really encouraged. Maybe it looked like the monarchs weren't going to disappear after all. Why were they there? Well, they had Monarch's Delight. They also had another species of milkweed. I think that's purple milkweed, which means they had their nectar that they needed, but they also had their host plant. They could reproduce. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan. The middle of bustling Manhattan. The High Line is an elevated railroad that was abandoned years ago. They turned it into a tourist destination. Somebody had gone up when it was abandoned. There were a lot of native plants growing up there, so they decided to fix it up. It is now a major tourist destination. Millions of people go to the High Line every year. It's 30 feet above the taxis, right in the middle of construction, and this is the amount of nature that's there. Not much, about a 3-foot strip. Now this is Rick Dark. He was always after me to go to the High Line and see the beautiful plants. I'm not much of a city boy, so I always drag my feet. And going and seeing beautiful plants with nothing using them is actually depressing to me. And that's what I thought I'd see in the middle of Manhattan. After all, how could anything get to the middle of Manhattan? Well, I was completely wrong. All those things got to the middle of Manhattan. Somebody has just done a study of the bees in the High Line. They're up to 30 species using it. So it's really encouraging to me. If thoughtful native plantings can bring life back to the middle of Manhattan, just a little strip of plantings, we can do this anywhere. We can succeed anywhere. But there are 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And one of the most important is we have to shrink the area that's in lawn. We have over 40 million acres of lawn in this country. which is the size of New England, dedicated to an ecologically dead landscape. It's a status symbol. And I understand we humans need our status symbols. We have to advertise the fact that we're good citizens, we're team players, but let's cut the area of lawn in half. We're going to still manicure the lawn that we have, but let's cut it in half and put in a lot of plants. If we cut the area of lawn in this country in half, that'll give us 20 million acres, 20 million more acres to put towards conservation. And if we do that at home, we can create a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. What are the advantages of having a park at home? There are a number of them. You can establish a personal relationship with some aspect of the natural world at your own pace, your own time. All you have to do is go outside. You don't have to travel. No travel hassles. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, there are millions of people there with you. It's free. There's no admission charge. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. But here's the real advantage. You get to experience the natural world alone. It's hard to do that in another national park. What's the advantage of experiencing it alone? That's what you need, I think, to develop that personal relationship, especially our kids. Our kids right now are suffering from what Richard Luke calls nature deficit disorder. They have no interaction with the natural world, that's a critical mistake on our part because they're the future stewards of our planet. If they don't know what they're supposed to be stewarding or why they're supposed to be stewarding it or want to steward it, they're going to be lousy stewards. So we're putting them on a bus with 30 other kids and a teacher, and they drive for an hour and they walk around a natural place. Then they go back to where they came from. Teacher tells them not to touch anything when they're outside. What they've really had, I mean, that's probably better than nothing, but what they really had was an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have a park at home, they can go outside alone. No parental supervision. Let them risk it. Let them discover the natural world on their own. Most of them will make it back alive. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very small patch of nature, and it's not all that natural. It's grass and a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. So this is how you hunt anole lizards. She instructed me very carefully. You get on the ground and you disguise yourself with sticks and leaves so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business here. You can wear your best dress, that's okay, but you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, and then you have that personal relationship with that part of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress the rest of her life catching lizards. I don't think. But I guarantee she's going to remember these experiences the rest of her life. And I also guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet because of it. If you want to do more than catch lizards or expose your kids to more than lizards, get this book, Nature Play at Home by Nancy Stranisti. She describes dozens of ways that you can get your kids exposed to nature right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and get yourself on the map. What you do is you follow the directions to tell us where you're cutting your lawn in half, where you're putting in those natives or where you already have. And then your little piece of the world will light up. And the object is to make this get it to go viral. We want to convince your neighbors, everybody to do it. So we're competing. How can get more people in your county on the map than any other county, more people in Pennsylvania than any other state. So far we have, I think, 3,600 people on the map. So we got a ways to go, but the object is to get 20 million acres replanted and have it all lit up here. But you know, why stop at 20 million acres? We can do the whole country. You can even get a sign. You can get a sign and put it in your yard showing that you are a member of Homegrown National Park. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants are we going to put in the areas we take out of the lawn? Well, some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a Roman arch was the stone in the middle of the Roman arch is called the keystone. And if you take the keystone out, the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of the food web collapses because these plants are making more food than any other type of plant. They're essential to the local food webs. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. These plants are like the 2x4s in a house when you're building a house. You can't leave the 2x4s out and only build your house out of wallpaper. They're essential. The house isn't finished when you just use the 2x4s. So we want to put a lot of other plants in as well, but these guys are essential. That's what a keystone plant is. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are, but there are a lot of natives who are that are not all that productive. So we want to focus on the most ecologically productive plants to restore the food webs as quickly as we can. That's the question. Do we want to do that, or do we want to go with benign plants, or even worse, those ecologically destructive plants, the ones that escape our yard, like burning bush or calorie pear or barberry, and then biologically pollute all the natural areas around us? Every once in a while, I get an email from somebody saying, don't you know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether or not that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's whether they're productive or not. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. For all intents and purposes, they produce 0 species of caterpillars. There are 2 rare records of species using it, but I've never found them. I don't know anybody who's found them. So that's what a ginkgo is going to look like, no caterpillars. Compared to an oak. In the mid-Atlantic states, oaks support 557 species of caterpillars, 557 species of bird food. Nationwide, they support 900 species. There's no other plant genus that comes close to oaks in terms of productivity. So this is an example of what keystone oaks do in our yard here. Now remember, I've taken pictures of 1,031 moth species so far in my yard. Out of that 1,031 species, 907 have known host plants. So there's more than 100, I don't know what they're eating. Out of the 907 species, 267 use oaks. And we have 69 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is the genus Quercus, the oaks. And we have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity. Yet they're supporting almost 30% of our moth species diversity. So imagine what would happen to the total diversity of our yard if we took the oaks away. That's the role of a keystone plant. How do you know what the keystone plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder on National Wildlife Federation website, or Audubon has a similar website called Plants for Birds. You put in your zip code and the ranked list of both the woody and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. Oaks are going to be number 1 in anywhere in Pennsylvania. Actually, in 84% of the counties, they are number 1. 84% of the counties of North America. So notice I'm saying native oaks, native cherries, native willows, native birches, native maples. If you go to the nursery and say, I want to buy a cherry, I'll bet you anything they will sell you an Asian ornamental cherry. I want to buy a willow. They'll sell you a weeping willow from Turkey. I want to buy a birch. They'll sell you the weeping birch from Europe, or the Japanese maple. You've got to specify that you want native members of these genera. Because if you don't, they'll sell you a non-native member, because that's what they've been selling forever, and you will reduce caterpillar use by 65%, even though these are native genera. These are the top herbaceous plants in terms of supporting caterpillars. But they're also the top, these solidago, goldenrods, and the various aster genera, various species of perennial sunflowers are also top in terms of supporting specialist bees. We want to support specialist bees because the generalists can use those plants as well. But if we only plant for the generalists, we lose all the specialist bees, the bees that can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So with those 3 genera right there, you can support over 40 species of native bees in your yard. And if you don't have those genera, that's 40 species of native bees that will be missing. All right, we're going to cut the lawn in half, put in keystone plants, attract a lot of insects to our yard, particularly moths, and then we're going to kill them with our security light. And of course, that is not the goal. There's a lot of research coming out these days, much of it from Europe, that is suggesting that one of the major causes of insect decline is light pollution at night. There's all these ways that lights kill insects, particularly moths, through exhaustion. You know, the moth flies around and around and around till it simply drops. It collides with the light bulb, it gets incinerated, dies from dehydration. The bat comes and picks it off. Bright lights blind a lot of nocturnal insects. Who knew? And it keeps them from doing what they're supposed to be doing. So this is actually good news to me. If light pollution is a major cause of insects decline, it is the easiest one to reverse. Just flick a switch, turn your light off. We can all reverse it overnight. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn my light off because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on your security light. So it only turns off. It only comes on when the bad man comes. And the first thing you're going to recognize is that the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white light out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to insects and kill far fewer insects. And yellow LED bulbs are the least attractive to insects of all the types of wavelengths you can use. If we were to switch out our white lights over our porches, our garages, for yellow LED lights overnight, we would save billions of insects during the summer season. And we'd also probably save billions of dollars because they are the most energy efficient. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to turn out our lights. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come and kill all the insects that we've attracted to our yard. This is a booming business around the country right now. Mosquito Joe is effectively reversing everything I've been working on for the last 15 years. And he will say, well, you know, this is a natural product, so it's okay. It is a natural product. It's pyrethroids, get them from chrysanthemums, but cyanide is a natural product too. So that's not a good argument. He'll also say it only kills mosquitoes. That's just plain wrong. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with. The big thing is it doesn't work. That's why Mosquito Joe has to come back and back and back. If you want to control mosquitoes, you don't control them in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. You have to kill 90% of the mosquitoes to control them in the adult stage. And fogging kills only about 10% of the mosquitoes. The way to kill mosquitoes is to get a bucket, a big bucket, fill it full of water, put in some straw or hay and let it ferment for a couple of days. Then put in a mosquito dunk. You get this at the hardware store. It's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacterium that kills aquatic diptera. You put it in your bucket, and the mosquito eggs will hatch into larvae. They'll nibble on this and then they die. It's totally targeted towards mosquitoes. You can have a dragonfly in here and it's not going to hurt it. Your dog can lick it or the birds will drink it. Not going to hurt them at all. And it's cheap too. Oh, by the way, Mosquito Joe is pretty expensive. So this is a cheaper alternative and it works much better. The fourth thing we need to do is to design landscapes that allow caterpillars to complete their development. This is really, really important, and we're just starting to learn about it. So in Chester County, Pennsylvania, there are 511 species of caterpillars that develop on oaks. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth caterpillar, can complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, they spin a cocoon and hang from the branch. Then the adult emerges and they do it all again. Everything happens on the tree. But that's unusual. Most of the species, 480 of them, 94%, when the caterpillar finishes growing, it drops from the tree and wiggles its way below the surface of the soil and then pupates underground, or it spins a cocoon in the leaf litter under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree, and we mow and compact the soil around our trees so much that the caterpillars can't get below ground. So the way we typically landscape becomes an ecological trap. We call in the moths to lay their eggs, the caterpillars develop, they drop down, and then they die. The next generation is much smaller, and the generation after that is gone altogether. I am convinced that this type of landscaping is another one of the major causes of insect declines. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. I'm not trying to suggest we shouldn't put trees in our cities. I am trying to minimize the use of cement as a default landscape in our cities. This is just a bad idea. It's laziness. We know it destroys our watershed. And cement, by the way, is a major emitter of carbon dioxide, a major emitter of greenhouse gases. This is what we usually do. We put a tree in a yard with a lot of grass, and nobody has measured the success of caterpillars in a situation like this when they fall out of the tree. But I guarantee it's going to be higher in a situation like this, where you have a tree, then a layered landscape, maybe a dogwood here, and then a native azalea and ferns and a ground cover. Caterpillar drops down to a safe site. The soil's not compacted. Nobody's going to mow them or step on them. They can get below the surface or spin their cocoon. They'll have much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink your lawn, folks. You put big beds around your trees. The bigger, the better. It's a safe site. This is where you can use your ground covers, things like wild ginger or mayapple or foam flower or ferns. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. These are red maple trees. Even though it's the middle of a city, any caterpillar that develops on this red maple can drop down to a safe site and make it. Another grad student, Desiree Narango, has done some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results suggest that there is room for compromise in our plant choices, and that's good news. What she did was compare how well chickadee populations could reproduce, could be sustained in landscapes dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by introduced plants. And this is in typical suburban lots. The first thing she found is that when they're dominated by introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, they reduce the chickadee food by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. They all had nest boxes up, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try. If they did try, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. The clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to reach maturity. So if you put all that together into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. This dotted line is replacement rate. If the population reproduces at this rate, it's a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking. So it can go on forever. What it's doing is replacing the adults that die every year. If you make more babies than adults that die every year, you have a growing population. But if you make fewer, you have a shrinking population. So anything below the line here is a shrinking population. Right here is where those lines overlap generously, which means you can have up to 30% of the woody plant biomass in your yard, non-native, and still have a sustainable population. But as soon as you exceed 30%, you're down in this area of the curve. You've got too many non-native plants reducing the food available for your birds by too much. So I'm excited about this study for two reasons. This is the first time this has been demonstrated for any bird anywhere. So anybody who doubts that your plant choices will determine how well other organisms do in your yard should take a look at this study. But this is the area of compromise that I'm talking about. You can have your crepe myrtle, you can have your ginkgo, you can have your boxwood. You can't have anything that's invasive, because that's like releasing smallpox spores on your property. But a lot of your forsythia, a lot of those ornamentals are not invasive. They're not going anywhere. And as long as they don't exceed 30% of your woody plant biomass, you can have sustainable breeding bird populations. And that's good news to me, because if my message was you can't have any non-native plants at all, very few people would be following this. We love our non-native plants. It's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. So if we get these guys back into the landscape, we can tolerate these. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a garden in North Carolina. Somebody sent me this email. What they're doing is replacing all of these plants with native plants. Here they put in Joe Pye. Notice I didn't call it Joe Pye weed. It's not a weed. And their goal is to replace all these plants and then send me another picture. Remember, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban lot like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. It's beautiful. It's got a lot of species. It's servicing a number of species of native bees. It's not very big, but if everybody did it, that amount of forage would add up. How about this? It's a much bigger area. Imagine the amount of life that is here versus the amount of life that is here. A lot of people, I don't like the explanation for why we need pollinators, because, well, they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops. But what if you don't live next to an ag field? A lot of people say, well, then I don't need any pollinators. That's crazy. They pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. It's not an option. So where do you need pollinators? Everywhere where you need plants, which is everywhere, including our yards. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and more are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program that encourages homeowners to replace some or all of their lawn with productive native plants, particularly the prairie plants that are common in the oak savannas of Minnesota. They help you pay for it. Pennsylvania, I just learned about this the other day. Pennsylvania has a lawn conversion program. You can get up to $5,000 per acre to help you convert your lawn to a native planting. Good deal. Should all be taking advantage of this. Florida. There's an island off of Florida that is paying residents to allow burrowing owls to nest in their front lawns. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. Rather than punishing somebody for having an endangered species on their property, we should pay them to take care of it. Everybody would want an endangered species. Missouri and Fayetteville, Arkansas have a bounty on calorie pears. You take out your calorie pear and they give you a free tree replacement. And even public utilities are getting into the act. In San Antonio, they get $100 coupons if you put in water efficient native species. Buffalo's giving people $100 coupons just to add natives. There's nothing to do with water conservation. And of course, we have all of those lawn replacement programs in the far west, particularly California, where you get up to $2 per square foot rebate for getting rid of your thirsty lawn and putting in appropriate xeric plantings. You know, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. The first one is that we don't think nature's essential. We like it, and many of us think it's important, but not essential. And that's the problem, because if nature's not essential, every time there's shortage of resources, push comes to shove, nature takes a back seat. We choose something we think is essential. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster there that to me epitomizes the way our society views conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife for future generations to enjoy. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for making the national parks. You want to save these parks so that future generations can enjoy the splendor of the US. And I agree. I mean, future generations can enjoy it, but it suggests nature is there just for entertainment, which is not essential. Nature is much more important than entertainment. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. Second misstep is that we've assumed humans and nature cannot coexist. And we talked about this. If we restrict conservation, just to where there's very few humans, we're going to fail because those areas aren't big enough to sustain the amount of nature that we need. David Quammen has a very effective analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That is 71 rug fragments, none of them acting like a Persian rug. And this is what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I hate that language because it suggests they're places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides. So what we need to do is put the plants back. We need to glue our rug back together again, stitch our ecosystems back together again by reducing the area that's in lawn, by putting in those keystone plants, putting in those pollinator gardens, taking out the invasive species. We're not just building biological corridors that connect the viable habitats that are out there. We're creating viable habitat where there wasn't any before. In other words, we're going to start to share our spaces with nature. Our third misstep is to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every person on the planet. And I don't know why, because every person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility for good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said that Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We've been great at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers what their obligations are toward the only planet that we have. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And I love that approach because it empowers each one of us. You know, the Earth has huge problems these days, and it's very easy to feel powerless in addressing these problems. But in this case, the cliche works. A single person can make a difference, and you can see that difference. Plant that oak tree, shrink your lawn, put in your pollinator garden, get rid of your invasives, watch the ecosystem in your yard return. It's fun, it works, and it makes you an important cog in the future wheel of conservation. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problem. Just worry about your piece of the Earth. If you own property, that's obvious. That's where you're going to work. And if everybody fixed up their own property, we'd be 85% done east of the Mississippi. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy. Help a park. Help any of these big planning programs that you've heard about tonight. In other words, volunteer. They'll love you. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. And I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Great talk. We have questions for Doug. So, well, we had Doug, you had over 300 people listening to you.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah. So I think one is some people are not gardeners.
Right.
What do you tell them? Most
people aren't gardeners. So what I tell them is, what do they do right now? They hire a lawn service, or they hire a gardener. They don't have time to deal with it. And what I'd like to do is expand, or actually build that industry. I call them ecological gardeners or ecological landscapers. You simply hire somebody, so you don't have to worry about this. You don't have to pick the right plants. You don't have to install them or manage them. That's what instead of hiring the lawnmower guy, you're going to hire these people. And I would like, a lot of people say we're going to put the lawn industry out of business. I don't want to change what they do so that it's more ecologically friendly. So you don't have to become a gardener. But if right now it's hard to find those people, we don't have that many that are trained. But one thing you can do, you don't have to be a gardener to walk outside and plant a single tree. And I suggest you make it a small tree, because small trees grow and they'll be much healthier if you start small. Anybody can do that.
Right, and I guess you mentioned particularly your homegrown national park website.
Exactly. A lot of resources on that will tell you how to do that.
What about cultivars of native plants?
Yeah, that's the most common question I get. If you go to the nursery and you ask for a native plant, 9 times out of 10, it's a cultivar of a native plant, a genetic variant of the straight species. So the question is that as ecologically viable as the straight species? And the answer, I mean, there has not been a lot of research here. We did a study, and Annie White in Vermont has done some studies. But the answer is it depends. It depends on what the genetic trait was that was changed. We looked at 6 common genetic traits that create cultivars, not focusing on flowers. But if you take a tall plant and you make it short, or if you introduce disease resistance, or if you take a green leaf and make it red or purple, or make it variegated, or increase berry size, traits like that. And the only trait that significantly reduced insect use, this was in a big common garden experiment for 3 years. The only trait that reduced insect use consistently was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple. And that's because we've loaded those leaves with anthocyanins that are feeding deterrents. So all of those red leaf cultivars that we seem to love so much, I don't know why, I think they're all ugly, but those are the ones that you should avoid. Now, Annie White has worked with flowers. Most of our cultivars do focus on flowers. We make echinaceas look like zinnias, and it's all focused, most of it is focused on aesthetics, trying to give people new varieties each year so that they will keep buying them. It's like hemlines that go up and down. And she found that particularly regarding the specialist bees that are very sensitive to the type of flower they've co-evolved with, when we change the traits of those flowers, it often messes up the relationship with the specialist bees, and we don't want to do that. Not always, but a lot of the time. There's a problem about cultivars that I do want to mention, and that is they're mostly propagated clonally, which means we're putting 0 genetic variability out there in the landscape. And we know that's a bad idea, particularly in the age of climate change, where we need as much genetic variability to be able to adapt to the wild climate swings that we're seeing more and more each year. As much genetic variability as possible. So I would love to see nurseries carry more straight species so that you have a choice when you go to the nursery. If you ask for a straight species and they don't have it, don't settle for the cultivar, leave. Say, okay, I'll go someplace else. And if enough people say that, they'll start to carry them. They just don't believe that there's a market for it right now.
Here's a question from the chat. I'm wondering what your suggestions are for dealing with deer pressure. I have a lot of issues with natives woody plantings getting browsed to death before they're able to establish.
Right. It's a serious problem. My suggestion is the obvious one. We have to reduce the number of deer. We've accepted the fact that overabundance of deer is going to be a feature of the landscape forever. It can't be. They're destroying our forests. They eat they prevent the young canopy trees from establishing. If a baby oak pops its head up in the forest, the deer get it that first year. So if you do that for 100 years, you don't have any more oak trees. You don't have any more forest. And they also avoid the invasive plants. They don't like autumn olive. They don't like burning bush. They don't like barberry. And that's why they spread like crazy, or bush honeysuckle. So the deer are tipping the competitive advantage against our native plants. What do we do about it? We know what to do about it. We just have a cultural inhibition to controlling deer. We've taken away their predators. The only option, the 2 options, put the predators back and they'll control the deer, or we have to be the predators. Those are our 2 choices. Now, I know it's hard for a single homeowner. We've got a big deer problem too. So what I do is I put those galvanized metal cages you were talking about around the young plantings, particularly my woody plants, my young trees. And I keep them there until I call it graduations. When they get big enough to withstand some deer herbivory, I move the cage around. And we've been here 20 years now, and I'm still using the same cages I started with, moving them all around. So they last a long time. Downside, of course, is that they're ugly. I get that. But you're right. If you don't protect your young plantings, the deer nail them. Spraying deer repellents on the plant is a lot of work. Every time I've tried it, I've gotten you work hard, and every time it rains, you got to go do it again. Then you miss one day and the deer nails you. So I've given up on that. It also probably changes the chemistry of the plant to the point where the insects you're trying to help don't use it. So the cages do work pretty well.
Yeah, I've had success with using metal cages and up to 6 feet. And then whatever goes beyond 6 feet will
Right.
pretty well.
One more thing I want to mention is a lot of people say, well, I'll just plant deer resistant plants. There are deer resistant plants. Spicebush is one, but then you end up with an unproductive landscape because the deer like the most productive plants, just like our insects do. So they're if you only focus on plants the deer won't touch, you're not going to have any keystone species at all.
So here's a question. If you have a small backyard in the east side of Pittsburgh, what is the single best intervention to encourage caterpillars if replacing trees in a rather shady garden is not an option?
Is it shady because there are trees there?
I guess there are some big trees there that they cannot replace. They're not allowed to replace them.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Viburnums, are much smaller, and they support about 120 species of caterpillars. So that's a good one. Mm-hmm. But keep in mind, caterpillars do best in a sunny environment. So if you have a viburnum in the shade and a viburnum in the sun, the moth will lay her eggs on the viburnum in the sun because those are the high nitrogen leaves. So if you truly have a lot of shade, the caterpillars are going to be up in the canopy of those plants that are creating the shade.
Another question.
You might not have a lot of options there, is what I'm trying to say. Well, you know what you can do though? You can protect the caterpillars that are growing in the canopy by creating those beds under the trees so that when they fall down, they can complete their development. That'd be a very productive thing to do.
So mulch, leaf mulch
Leaf mulch is fine, but if you want more than that, then put in the ground covers. Virginia creeper is a great ground cover, by the way.
Can you give any recommendations for managing leaf litter appropriately? Can we mulch it with our lawnmower and rake it to specific areas? How late in the season can we move leaf litter to avoid neighbor ire, but not disrupting insects' life cycle?
Okay. When the leaves fall in the fall, they're going to fall everywhere. So if on the areas of lawn that you're keeping, you have to rake them off the lawn. That is the time to do it right away. And raking is gentle raking is better than leaf blowing. And you put them in your flower beds, and then you leave them for the winter time. If you grind them up in your lawnmower, that Luna moth cocoon that is down there in the leaves, you just ground up your Luna moth too, and all of the things that have spun their cocoons in the leaves have been ground up. So that's pretty destructive to the things that are in those leaves. It's also, people are doing that for aesthetics for the most part, or I guess, they don't want the whole leaves to blow around, and they don't blow once you grind them up. But if you can keep them still until you get a couple of good rains, they blow a lot less, but try to avoid grinding them up. My son bought a house a couple of years ago, and he called me up in the fall and he said, "Dad, I've got too many leaves." I said, "Well, rake them in your flower bed." He said, "I don't have enough flower beds." I said, "Exactly. That's how you shrink your lawn. Create those flower beds with the leaves around the base of your trees, and then you can plant within it."
Here's a technical question. you have written that crab apples, even crab apples from Asia, are roughly similar to the native American crab apples. In other words, I guess the chemicals that are in the leaves are similar. And crab apples is one of the higher species in terms of getting moths and butterflies. So crab apples is a good one. What about Norway spruce?
Okay, that's another good example. Norway spruces in general, again, are chemically very close to each other, and they're practically circumpolar in terms of their distribution. There is an aphid that's pretty common on Norway spruce, and there are birds that will use it heavily, particularly in times of like late fall. Birds use Norway spruce for cover a lot. And the birds that rely on seeds, like crossbills, will come down when there's a seed crop failure in Canada and eat the Norway spruce seeds that are in our yards. So those are the upsides of Norway spruce. It's not a top caterpillar producer.
Well, are other spruces better?
You know, I don't think anybody's done those common garden experiments, so I can't say. It's certainly not. It's not invasive, and it's certainly not a top priority on my hit list. So if you have a Norway spruce, it is contributing at least some. I wouldn't, we have a lot of Norway spruces where spruces wouldn't normally grow, and so getting the hardwoods back, particularly in southwest Pennsylvania, would probably be a better bet. But Norway spruces do contribute on some level.
Your homegrown national park map is only the continental U.S.
Yeah.
Are you going to include Canada?
Oh, actually, yeah, we are including Canada. They're going to help us support it. You know, the problem with our homegrown national park map and the whole website is it's been a great idea, but it's turned out to be a tremendous amount of work, and we have no financial support for it. So people say, well, why don't you expand it to the whole world? Well, we'd love to, but we need some income to be able to do that. So
NSF grant proposal, or
to whom? You have any ideas?
NSF, National Science.
NSF. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I'll think about it.
They're tough, but
yeah.
Let's see. Let me go back to the questions. How productive is the native black walnut tree?
It's good. It's in the top 10. People, walnut has a bad reputation because it produces a compound called juglone, and particularly in the nuts themselves. Once I collected a whole bunch of black walnuts, I was going to split them open and get the meat and do the food thing. So I piled them in my cellar and never got around to it. Well, they all kind of melted down into this black goo that permanently stained that floor. I mean, that's juglone. And if you have a lot of juglone, it can kill. It's particularly hard on ericaceous plants. So things like azaleas or rhododendrons don't do well under black walnuts. But that's been extrapolated to say, well, plants won't grow under a black walnut, but you go out in nature, you look there. I've got black walnuts all over my property, and everything's growing under them. So the only thing I've seen that are sensitive are those ericaceous plants. Otherwise, it's a good plant and it fits in. Of course, it makes walnuts, and then the squirrels move them around. So it spreads pretty quickly on your property. You don't want to end up with a walnut monoculture, but otherwise it's good.
Let's see. This is a question. Let's see. How are changing leafing out and flowering times caused by climate change affecting the connection between insects and the plants they specialize on?
Somewhat. It's not well studied. The connection between caterpillar production and the birds that eat them, the migrants that are coming through, has been better studied. And there is some asynchrony. The birds are showing up after the insects have already matured because they came out too early because of climate change. Or some places in Europe, it's actually the reverse. It's decoupling these very special interactions. So it is a problem. It's of concern. Insects are pretty good though at tracking their host plants. Insect eggs, a lot of them are actually hooked into the vascular system of the plant. So if the climate changes when the sap starts to flow in the plant, it actually controls when those eggs hatch. So insects are better coupled to their host plant than the birds that are trying to track it. But it's an issue on some level. The biggest problem with climate change that I have found is the extremeness of the weather. The heavy rains that we get in the summertime can just scour the leaves and knock those insects off and drown them. The serious droughts that we're having in the West are very hard on the insects. Those two things combined, the cool, wet, repeated springs that we've had have been very hard, and they knock down those butterfly populations for a couple months in the summertime. So it's those types of extremes that have been more harmful, I think, to our insects than the actually decoupling.
Okay. It is not commercial agriculture a major cause of insect decline? Will our efforts to support insects in our yards make much of a dent in the reduction of insects from agriculture?
Yes, because we've got so many acres in our yard. About 49% of the US is in some form of agriculture, and the 51% is in this suburban urban matrix that I talk about. Now, some of that includes the patches of woods that we have, but an awful lot of that is our yards and our managed landscapes. So, so yes, we can help a lot. We have, agriculture is kind of important. We're not going to get rid of it. We can do better in agriculture. Mm-hmm. The advent of Roundup Ready corn and soybeans has allowed growers to spray right up to the road now to get rid of all the quote weeds. That's the milkweed, the asters, all those things that support our monarchs and all the native bees and many other things. They're our good native plants that they spray. And then they plant lawn because of the ability to do that. That has devastated biodiversity in the Midwest in particular. So that's an overuse of a product. That could be fixed. Put those, we call them pollinator strips, but put them back along the edges of the corn and the soybeans. It doesn't reduce yield at all. And it would actually save money. So it would reduce erosion. There's a lot of good things about it. And some growers are starting to do that. So we can improve, we can put hedgerows back more than we've taken hedgerows out just for convenience. There are a lot of places we could put them back, make them native plants and not invasives. So there's ways to improve agriculture, but all the places that are not in agriculture will be very important in terms of sustaining the biodiversity.
Yeah, back with respect to agriculture, is it possible to get legislators to say, hey, you can plant the native hedgerows, like I guess England is full of hedgerows.
Well, they've pulled theirs out too in so many places, and that's why the English sparrow and the starling, two invasive species around the world, they're on the red list in England now because they have sterilized the countryside so much. Can we encourage farmers to put it back? Sure we can, but we should give them incentives. Well, don't say do it or I'm going to fine you.
Well, there are these CRP programs in.
Yeah, I think there's minimum acreage for those.
Right, at least you have to have at least 10 acres or something.
Yeah, so just those little strips along the roadside, that's really important.
Right, and then they wouldn't have to mow it.
Then they wouldn't have to mow it, exactly.
The gasoline for mowing is just.
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's the question. We have a large, mature 50-foot Ailanthus, which is a tree of heaven, in a vacant lot next to our house. I'm worried about spotted lanternfly. How can we get rid of it?
You should be worried about spotted lanternfly. It's their favorite host plant, particularly as nymphs. They use it a lot. How can you get rid of it? Chainsaw will work. Um, I guess you're saying you don't own that lot?
It's a lot next to them, right? Next to our house.
You know, the spotted lanternfly is a big problem, and we know that that's a major host plant at this point. I think you could contact your city officials and say that's got to go. It shouldn't be there to begin with, but you're really encouraging an invasive species that is clobbering the grape industry. It's clobbering the apple industry, and you know, somebody owns that lot. They're responsible for getting rid of that.
So I'm recording this this presentation, and I will put it out on YouTube. And I will also try to take all the questions from the. Oh, here's a question. How are moths and butterflies finding these very isolated food plants that you planted on your property? Is it luck, reconnaissance, long distance scent? It just seems so improbable.
Yeah, good question. Good question. It is scent. They find them by chemistry. So how far can they do it? Well, we're not sure. I'm not sure where the founders on my property have come from. You know, the Canadian owlet is a great one. I just don't know of any around here, but insects do move around. They move around pretty well. They can move around on storm fronts. When I was a graduate student, I got my master's at Rutgers, and we were crowded when I was there in the 70s, and I sat in the museum. That was where my office was. And a guy in the museum, his job was to go through light trap catches every day from South Jersey. And he would regularly get sphinx moths from South America in those light trap cages. So moths in particular do get around. Some of it could be luck, but they are guided to their host plant by chemistry. So how far those plumes go, I'm not sure, but it does work, and that's the encouraging thing.
Here's a question. If I have a relatively small plot, 1/5 of an acre, how effective is it for me to be planting natives? How important is it to get my neighbors on board and create a larger area?
The larger, the better. But the reason I give you examples of like the Highline or Pam Carlson's yard of 1/10 of an acre is that small lots will work on some level too. The bigger, the better, for sure. What I would love is, I mean, this is what the Homegrown National Park is about, to get enough people involved that you will create a minimum mass that will be more effective. There's no doubt about it. What that, you know, even a potted plant can help a monarch. So there's no place that's too small, but there's also no place that's too big. And if you have a tiny lot, you're attached to another tiny lot. So getting your neighbor involved would be great. You double your effort. Thinking of it at a neighborhood scale allows you to take advantage of many more niches. Tiny lots, you know, they're either in the sun or the shade. They often don't have both because they're just too small to have all those areas. So if you have your entire neighborhood, somebody could do the pollinator garden, somebody could have the oak, and you know, you can divvy up the ecological responsibilities easier. So this could be a good excuse to actually get to know your neighbors and you know, have a common goal.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is I got to know my neighbors. We have bonfires together, and
there you go. That's great.
And you know, they're not doing anything with their woods, and so I got, you know, they're agreeable people, and so I got them to allow me to, you know, get rid of the barberry, get rid of, you know, the ailanthus, get rid of, you know, all these things, and a lot of work.
It's a great story. It's a great story.
Yeah, and then plant things, and I think, you know, things are changing. I think, you know, like, I think we're going to put in maybe 500 aspen so that we can maybe get one place to be able to get woodcock to show up.
Well, aspen's a great moth tree too. You get a lot of things on aspen.
Let's see, was there another question here? Oh, is there, I'm trying to ask all the questions. Is there an umbrella organization that compiles resources for small local groups? We are looking to influence landscaping practices in the Hamptons, New York.
In the Hamptons, New York, there's a woman who has started a project called 2/3 for the Birds, right in the Hamptons. Edwina Van Gaal. So she would be the one that could coordinate anything you want to do. Edwina Van Gaal, 2/3 for the Birds. I think her website is up and functioning now.
Another education question. Brilliant. Are there resources we can share in schools with students at multiple grades so they can learn this?
No, not yet. I get that all the time. I've got to do that. I've got to do that. I can't finish my email every day. But you're right. That's very important. And I want, I talked to some teachers about what the best resources would be. Is it something that's written that they can read, or is it a video that they can watch? How would it be used in a curriculum? I don't want to create something that the teachers say, well, I don't have time to change the curriculum at all. So those have all been excuses why I haven't done anything yet, but it's an important age group. I really need to do something.
Okay, with that, I think it's 8:42. We've gotten you for a good period of time. Let's thank Izaak. Thank you so much. It was really great to have you, and particularly to explain what kinds of things everyone can do.
Well, thanks for the invitation. Good.
Okay.
All right. Thanks. Good night, everybody.
All right.